Cold linoleum echoed with heavy boots long before the billionaire woke up. Everyone at Mercy West assumed room 412 held just another tragic accident victim. They were completely wrong. When his eyes finally snapped open, he didn't ask for a doctor. He grabbed her throat and demanded his gun. Rain lashed against the ICU windows, smearing the neon lights of Boston into blurred streaks of red and gold. Sadie Jenkins stood in her light blue scrubs, eyes locked on the steady pulse of the heart monitor. It was 3:15 a.m., the loneliest stretch of her night shift at Mercy West Medical Center. For 90 days, this room had been her entire world. The patient was listed as John Doe, but everyone knew that wasn't the truth. Two men in charcoal suits stood guard outside the door, at all times silent, watchful, and never leaving their post together. Sadie picked up a fresh, warm washcloth from the basin. She approached the bed with the same gentle reverence she afforded all her patients. But there was an undeniable, heavy aura surrounding this particular man. His name was Declan Walsh. She had only learned it by accident, catching a hushed, terrified conversation between the chief of surgery and a broad-shouldered man named Callum O'Shea, who seemed to be Declan's second-in-command. Declan was the head of the Walsh Syndicate, a notoriously ruthless organized crime family that controlled the eastern seaboard's shipping ports. Yet, lying here, stripped of his bespoke suits and terrifying reputation, he just looked like a man fighting a losing battle. He was 32 years old, with sharp, aristocratic features that remained strikingly handsome despite the pale, waxy hue of his skin. Dark hair, thick and slightly curled at the ends, fell over his forehead. A jagged, angry scar slashed across his left collarbone, disappearing beneath the hospital gown, a violent contrast to the clean, crisp white sheets. "All right, mister." "Walsh," Sadie murmured, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the sterile hum of the medical machinery. She always spoke to him. The senior nurses thought she was wasting her breath, citing his Glasgow Coma scale score of 4, but Sadie believed in the power of the human voice. "I'm just going to clean your arms now. The storm is pretty bad out there tonight. The Charles River is probably close to overflowing." She gently lifted his right arm, carefully navigating around the intravenous lines, feeding him a cocktail of nutrients and broad-spectrum antibiotics. His muscles had atrophied slightly over the 3 months, but his raw, innate physical power was still evident. Intricate dark ink wrapped around his forearm, a sprawling tattoo of a raven clutching a broken crown. Declan had been brought in with 2 bullets in his chest and massive blunt force trauma to his skull, the result of what the local news called a tragic warehouse collapse and what the hospital staff whispered was an organized hit. He had flatlined twice on the operating table. Dr. Era Sterling had managed to dig the lead out of his lungs, but the swelling in his brain had forced him into a deep, seemingly irreversible coma. "I brought a new book tonight," Sadie continued, wiping down his knuckles. They were calloused, the hands of a man who didn't just order violence, but actively participated in it. "I finished the Fitzgerald novel. I thought maybe we could try something a little different. A bit of history. You seem like a man who appreciates strategy." She dried his arm and pulled the thermal blanket up to his chest. Sadie had grown up bouncing between foster homes in South Boston, surrounded by chaos and loud, angry voices. There was something profoundly grounding about the silence in room 412. Declan was dangerous, she knew that instinctively. But in this comatose state, he was completely vulnerable, entirely dependent on her care. Over the weeks, a strange, unspoken bond had formed in her chest. She found herself checking his charts even when she was off duty, worrying about his slight fevers, and feeling a bizarre sense of protectiveness when the suits outside rotated their shifts. Sadie pulled a small, battered paperback copy of The Art of War from her scrub pocket. She pulled up the plastic visitor's chair, sitting close to the bed railing. Chapter 1. She read softly, the rhythmic cadence of her voice filling the sterile room. The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. She read to him for an hour. The only interruption was the occasional sigh of the mechanical ventilator and the distant rumble of thunder. As she read, she watched his face. Sometimes, in the trick of the low light, she thought she saw a faint twitch in his jaw, or a microscopic shift in his closed eyelids beneath the medical tape. The neurologists had assured her these were merely autonomic reflexes, meaningless electrical misfires in a damaged brain. But Sadie wasn't so sure. Sometimes, when she held his hand to check his capillary refill, the temperature of his skin seemed to spike, as if he were burning from the inside out, fighting a war beneath the surface of his own mind. At 4:30 a.m., she marked her page and stood up to check his central line. "I'll be back tomorrow night, Declan," she whispered, briefly resting her hand on his forehead. "Keep fighting." For a fleeting second, the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor hitched, skipping a single beat before resuming its normal pace. Sadie froze, her eyes darting to the screen. Her own heart hammered against her ribs. She waited, holding her breath, but the green line stabilized. Just a glitch, she told herself. Just a machine glitch. She turned and walked out of the room, unaware that the countdown to absolute chaos had just begun. Tuesday night arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the hospital corridors like a damp wool blanket. Sadie clocked in at 11:00 p.m., a creeping sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. The hospital felt entirely wrong. The usual night shift banter at the nurse's station was muted, replaced by tense whispers and averted glances. When she walked down the west wing toward room 412, her unease morphed into icy dread. The two men in the charcoal suits Callum O'Shea's loyal guard dogs were gone. The hallway was completely empty, the silence ringing in Sadie's ears. She quickened her pace, pushing open the heavy oak door. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from the streetlights filtering through the blinds and the harsh glow of the medical equipment. Declan lay exactly as she had left him. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, the only sound in the room. Sadie immediately checked his vitals. Everything was stable. She exhaled a shaky breath, chiding herself for her paranoia. Perhaps the guards had just stepped down to the cafeteria. Perhaps Callum had recalled them for a brief meeting. She began her routine, drawing a fresh basin of water. As she turned her back to the door to adjust the thermostat, she heard the faint, nearly imperceptible squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. "The guards aren't supposed to leave their post," Sadie said without turning around, assuming one of the suits had returned. There was no answer. The hair on the back of Sadie's neck stood up. She slowly turned around. Standing in the doorway was a man wearing the light green scrubs of a hospital orderly. A blue surgical mask covered the lower half of his face, and a standard-issue ID badge was clipped to his chest. But the badge was flipped backward, hiding his face and name, and his eyes, pale, watery, and completely dead, were locked entirely on Declan. "Can I help you?" Sadie asked, taking a subtle step to place herself between the stranger and the bed. "This is a restricted room. No orderlies are scheduled for this wing tonight." The man didn't speak. He reached into the deep pocket of his scrubs. When his hand emerged, he wasn't holding a fresh IV bag or a set of clean towels. He was holding a sleek, black syringe filled with a thick, clear liquid. It wasn't standard hospital equipment. There was no medical label. Sadie's medical training kicked in instantly. Potassium chloride. Injected directly into the IV line, it would cause massive, immediate cardiac arrest. It would look exactly like a tragic, fatal complication from his injuries. "Hey!" Sadie shouted, her voice cracking with terror. "Get out of here!" She lunged toward the emergency call button on the wall, but the man was terrifyingly fast. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, backhanding Sadie across the face. The force of the blow sent her crashing into the tray table, metal instruments clattering violently to the floor. Pain exploded in her cheekbone, her vision swimming with dark spots. She scrambled backward, tasting copper in her mouth. The fake orderly ignored her, his eyes fixed on his prize. He stepped up to the bed, uncapping the needle with his teeth. He reached for the central line port near Declan's collarbone. "No!" Sadie screamed, throwing herself forward. She grabbed the man's wrist, digging her nails into his flesh. He snarled, twisting his arm and shoving her hard against the edge of the bed. Sadie's ribs slammed into the metal railing, knocking the wind out of her lungs in a brutal gasp. She slumped against the mattress, momentarily paralyzed by the pain. The orderly raised the syringe, aiming it directly at the port. Then, the unthinkable happened. The heart monitor, previously beeping at a steady, sluggish pace, suddenly began to shriek a rapid, terrifying staccato. Beep, 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 beep. Before the orderly could push the plunger, a large, pale hand shot out from beneath the thermal blanket. Long fingers, bruised and bearing the raven tattoo, clamped down on the orderly's wrist with the crushing force of an industrial vice. The syringe halted mere millimeters from the IV port. The orderly froze, his pale eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. Sadie, gasping for air against the bedrail, looked up. Her heart stopped. Declan Walsh's eyes were open. They were a startling, piercing shade of storm cloud gray, and they were entirely lucid. There was no confusion of a man waking from a 3-month slumber. There was only a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly violent clarity. The orderly tried to yank his arm back, panic setting in, but Declan's grip was immovable. Despite severe muscle atrophy, the sheer adrenaline pumping through the Mafia Boss's veins gave him monstrous strength. With a sickening crack, Declan violently twisted the man's wrist outward. The orderly screamed, dropping the syringe as his bones snapped. Before the attacker could retreat, Declan used his grip on the broken wrist to haul his own upper body off the mattress. He moved with the terrifying speed of a striking viper. Declan's other hand shot forward, bypassing the man's throat and grabbing a fistful of his scrub top. With a guttural, terrifying roar, Declan pulled the man down, simultaneously driving his own skull forward. The brutal headbutt echoed through the room like a gunshot. The orderly's nose shattered in a spray of crimson. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, entirely unconscious. Silence descended on the room, save for the frantic, screaming alarm of the heart monitor. Declan remained sitting up, his chest heaving violently beneath the hospital gown. Slowly, he turned his head. His cold, gray eyes locked onto Sadie, who was still slumped against the side of the bed, trembling uncontrollably. Her hand pressed against her bruising cheek. For a terrifying second, Sadie thought he might attack her next. He looked like a wild, cornered animal. Instead, Declan reached up with a shaking hand and brutally ripped the oxygen cannula from his nose. He coughed. A dry, agonizing sound, clearing his lungs for the first time in 90 days. He leaned over the edge of the bed, his face inches from hers. The smell of sterile alcohol and raw, primal danger radiated from him. "You," his voice was gravelly, broken, and dangerously low, rasping like sandpaper over wood. He didn't ask where he was. He didn't ask what year it was. He grabbed the fabric of Sadie's scrub top, not violently, but with an iron grip that told her she was not allowed to leave. "Turn off that damn machine," Declan commanded, his eyes darting to the door. "And give me your phone. Now." Panic clawed at Sadie's throat, but years of chaotic ER shifts forced her hands to steady. She slammed the monitor's master silence button. The shrieking alarm died instantly, leaving only the ragged breathing of the man on the bed and the bleeding assassin on the floor. She fumbled for her smartphone. Declan snatched it from her grasp with terrifying speed, his gray eyes scanning the screen. His trembling fingers dialed a sequence of numbers from memory. "It's me," Declan rasped, his voice a jagged whisper. He paused, listening to the explosion of relief on the other end. No names. "The hospital is compromised. Room 412 is burned. Bring the black sedan to the loading dock on level C. 5 minutes. Bring an extraction kit. He dropped the phone and immediately reached for the central line port taped to his chest. Stop! Sadie hissed, instinctively grabbing his wrist. You'll tear the subclavian vein and bleed out. Your body is in profound shock. Declan's piercing gaze dropped to her trembling hand on his forearm. He looked back up, the ghost of a terrifying smirk playing on his pale lips. You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are, Sadie retorted, shaking. But right now, you are my patient. You are not removing that line without a sterile pressure dressing. Surprisingly, he released the tubing and leaned back against the pillows, his chest heaving. Then do it, Nightingale, and do it fast. Because whoever sent this garbage, he kicked the unconscious orderly's boot, will send another when he misses his check-in. Sadie moved with frantic efficiency, clamping the line and smoothly withdrawing the catheter. She applied heavy, immediate pressure to his chest. Declan didn't flinch, though a sheen of cold sweat coated his skin. You need to hide, Declan commanded, throwing his legs over the side of the mattress. His knees instantly buckled. He grunted in pain, catching himself on the bed rail. When my people arrive, they'll scrub this room. You were never here. I have to call security, Sadie argued, taping down the gauze with shaky fingers. Security let him in, Declan snarled. He forced himself to stand, gripping the IV pole for support. If you call security, you're calling my executioners. And since you just saw his face, you're on their list now too. The reality hit her like a physical blow. She had thwarted a professional hit on the city's most dangerous man. Her normal life was effectively over. Level C loading dock, Sadie said, her voice surprisingly hollow. She pulled oversized surgical scrubs from a nearby closet. We have to go through the basement. The service elevators require my biometric scan. Declan studied her, seeing the terror but also the iron core of resilience beneath it. Get me dressed, he commanded softly. It was a grueling, agonizing process. She supported his heavy frame, a furnace of raw heat and suppressed agony. When they finally stepped out of the room, the hallway remained eerily deserted. Slipping her arm around his waist, they engaged in a painfully slow, three-legged race to the service elevator. Sadie pressed her thumb to the scanner. The heavy doors slid open, and they stumbled inside. Declan leaned heavily against the back wall, his eyes closed, his breathing a shallow, ragged rasp. Why did you do it? He asked suddenly, his voice echoing in the small metal box. You could have let him push that plunger. Declan opened his eyes, pinning her with a gaze that felt entirely too intimate. You read Sun Tzu to me. You held my hand. I heard you. Sadie's breath hitched. He heard her. You're my patient, she replied stubbornly, avoiding his intense stare. I save lives. I don't care whose they are. The elevator dinged, opening into the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of Level C. Massive industrial washing machines masked the sound of their footsteps as Sadie guided him through the maze of laundry carts. Approaching the loading dock doors, two massive figures stepped from the shadows. Sadie gasped, freezing in her tracks. Boss, the taller one said, his Irish brogue thick. He revealed a jagged scar across his chin. Jesus Christ. You look like a ghost. Good to see you too, Ronan, Declan muttered, his grip on Sadie's shoulder tightening. Is the car secure? Armored SUV, right outside, Ronan replied, eyeing Sadie suspiciously. Who's the collateral? She's the reason I'm breathing, Declan stated, brokering absolutely no argument. She comes with us. What? No, Sadie protested, trying to pull away. I got you here, we're done. Declan turned, grabbing her upper arms. His fading strength was backed by an immovable will. Listen to me, he said, his face inches from hers. You go back up there. You are a loose end. They will bury you under the Charles River. You're coming with me until I can guarantee your safety. Understood? Before she could argue, Ronan opened the loading dock door. The biting Boston night air rushed in. A black SUV sat idling in the alleyway. Sadie had no choice. She let them usher her into the back seat, Declan sliding in beside her. As the armored door slammed shut, plunging them into the dark leather interior, Sadie realized she had crossed a line from which she could never return. The SUV tore through the slick, rain-washed streets of Boston, avoiding Starrow Drive and weaving through the industrial backroads of Chelsea. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Declan had slipped into a semi-conscious state, his head resting back against the leather seat, his face contorted in pain. "He's burning up," Sadie said, pressing the back of her hand against his forehead. "His body is fighting the sudden adrenaline dump. He needs IV fluids and broad-spectrum antibiotics, or he's going to slip right back into a coma." "We've got supplies at the house," Ronan grunted from the front passenger seat, eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. A private doc was supposed to be on call, but he went dark 2 hours ago. "You're going to have to play doctor, sweetheart." They pulled into an abandoned shipyard, the SUV rumbling over rusted train tracks before slipping inside a massive, corrugated metal warehouse. The heavy doors rolled shut behind them, plunging them into a well-lit, surprisingly luxurious safe house built directly into the warehouse's interior framework. Ronan and the driver helped carry Declan inside, laying him on a large leather sofa in the center of the main room. Sadie immediately kicked into gear. She found the medical supply cache Ronan pointed out, a military-grade trauma kit that cost more than her yearly salary. She worked furiously, starting a new IV line in the crook of Declan's arm, hanging a bag of saline from a floor lamp. She pushed a heavy dose of antibiotics and a carefully measured amount of painkillers into the port. As she worked, she felt his eyes on her. Declan was watching her every move, his gaze sharp despite the fever clouding his system. "You have a very steady hand, Nightingale," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "My name is Sadie," she corrected sharply, checking his blood pressure cuff. "And my hands are steady because I'm terrified. If you die on my watch, I'm pretty sure your men will shoot me." "Ronan wouldn't shoot you," Declan replied, a faint, dark amusement coloring his tone. "He'd probably just lock you in the trunk." "Not funny." Sadie ripped the Velcro of the blood pressure cuff a little harder than necessary. She looked down at him, the harsh overhead lights casting deep shadows over the hollows of his cheeks. He was a brutal, violent man, yet looking at him now, stripped of his empire, she felt that same bizarre pull of protectiveness she had felt in room 412. "I remember the smell of vanilla," Declan said softly, out of nowhere. Sadie froze. She always wore a cheap vanilla body lotion. It was the only thing that masked the smell of hospital bleach. "I remember the sound of pages turning," he continued, his eyes locking onto hers, stripping her bare. "And I remember you telling me to keep fighting. Every time I wanted to let go, to just sink into the dark, I heard you." The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Sadie swallowed hard, her heart doing a frantic, erratic flutter against her ribs. This wasn't a mob boss talking to a hostage. This was a man baring his soul to the woman who had tethered him to the living world. Before she could respond, the heavy steel door to the safe house clanged loudly, the electronic deadbolts sliding back with a heavy thud. Ronan drew his weapon instantly, aiming it at the entrance. Sadie scrambled backward, putting the sofa between herself and the door. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a soaking wet, bespoke charcoal suit stepped into the room. He ran a hand through his dripping blonde hair, his handsome face twisted into a mask of relief. It was Callum O'Shea, Declan's second in command, the man who had been paying the guards outside room 412. "Jesus Christ, Declan," Callum breathed, rushing forward, ignoring Ronan's lowered gun. "When I got the call that the room was empty, I thought they took you. I thought you were dead." Declan struggled to sit up, groaning as his stitched muscles protested. "Who pulled the guards, Callum?" Callum stopped at the edge of the sofa, his eyes darting to Sadie for a fraction of a second before returning to his boss. "I did. We got a tip that the Moretti family was moving on the South Docks. I needed every gun we had. I thought you were safe. Nobody knew you were in 412 except the inner circle. Exactly, Declan said softly. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Nobody knew except the inner circle. Yet an orderly with a syringe of potassium chloride walked right through the front door 10 minutes after you pulled my detail. Callum's expression morphed into absolute offended shock. Are you accusing me, brother? I've bled for this family. I took a bullet for your father. You did, Declan agreed, his voice frighteningly calm. Which is why it breaks my heart, Callum. You got greedy. You wanted the shipping routes for yourself. You're paranoid, Callum scoffed, taking a step back. The coma scrambled your brains. Did it? Declan reached under the blanket Sadie had thrown over him, his hand emerging with a heavy, black Glock 19 he must have pulled from Ronan during the car ride. He aimed it directly at Callum's chest. When I was in the dark, Callum, I couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes, but my hearing was perfect. Callum froze, the color draining from his face. I heard the doctors talking, Declan continued, his finger slipping over the trigger guard. And I heard you, Callum. I heard you standing next to my bed 2 weeks ago, whispering to someone on the phone. You said, give it another month. If he doesn't die on his own, we'll help him along. I have the board's support. Sadie gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth. The betrayal hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Callum's mask of loyalty shattered. His eyes hardened into cold, calculating slits. He looked at the gun in Declan's trembling hand, then at his boss's pale, sweating face. You can barely hold that weapon, Declan, Callum sneered, his hand slowly drifting toward the inside of his suit jacket. You're a ghost. Your time is over. The syndicate needs a king, not a corpse. I may be a ghost, Declan whispered, his grip tightening on the handle. But I still know how to haunt. Callum lunged for the weapon holstered beneath his tailored jacket, calculating that Declan's weakened state would grant him the crucial millisecond needed to strike first. He was fundamentally wrong. Declan might have possessed the physical strength of a ghost, but his muscle memory was forged in the fires of a brutal, unforgiving underworld. He didn't hesitate. The heavy Glock kicked violently in his trembling grip. Bang. The deafening roar of the gunshot echoed off the corrugated metal walls of the safe house, a sharp, violent punctuation mark to a decade of misplaced trust. Callum staggered backward, a blossom of dark crimson spreading across the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt, right below his collarbone. He looked down at the wound in absolute disbelief, his eyes wide. You. Callum choked, dropping his half-drawn weapon onto the concrete floor. His knees buckled, sending him crashing onto the cold ground with a heavy thud. Ronan was instantly moving, his own weapon leveled at the fallen traitor. Don't twitch, Callum, or I swear to God I'll put the next one right between your eyes. Sadie scrambled over the back of the leather sofa, her hands covering her ears, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had spent her entire career trying to stop people from bleeding, fighting the fragile line between life and death. Now, she was trapped in a room where death was being dealt on purpose, orchestrated by the man she had just saved. Declan lowered the gun, his arm dropping to his side as if the weapon weighed 1,000 pounds. The burst of adrenaline that had fueled his awakening was rapidly burning out, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing exhaustion. His skin shifted from pale to a terrifying ashen gray. It doesn't matter, Callum coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Sadie's medical instincts flare, despite her profound terror. Blood trickled from the corner of the traitor's mouth. He looked up at Declan with a feral, blood-stained grin, exposing teeth stained with red. You think I came here alone? You think I didn't track the SUV? The Moretti family. They aren't at the South Docks, Declan. They're outside, right now. As if on cue, a massive explosion rocked the foundation of the warehouse. The heavy steel doors groaned in protest, and the overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently before dying completely, plunging the safe house into the eerie, crimson glow of emergency backup lighting. "Breach!" Ronan roared, abandoning Callum to sprint toward the reinforced front entrance. Heavy automatic gunfire began to rain against the exterior of the building, a terrifying hailstorm of lead and malice echoing through the vast space. Declan's eyes rolled back. The Glock slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor as he collapsed backward onto the leather sofa. The heart monitor Sadie had hooked up began to shriek its frantic warning once again. His blood pressure was plummeting rapidly. His body was entering severe hemorrhagic shock from the sheer stress of the exertion and his previously catastrophic injuries. "Declan!" Sadie screamed, diving over the armrest without a second thought for her own safety. She pressed her fingers to his carotid artery. His pulse was a frantic, thready flutter beneath his cold skin. The surgical sutures holding his chest wound together were weeping fresh blood, the trauma of the gun's recoil tearing at his delicate, healing flesh. "Ronan, he's coding!" she yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire outside. "Fix him!" Ronan shouted back, blind-firing his assault rifle through a specialized gun port in the heavy steel door. "I'm holding them off, but we need to move to the underground extraction tunnel immediately." Sadie ripped open the emergency medical kit. She didn't have a hospital crash cart. She didn't have an operating room or a team of surgeons. She had her bare hands, a few syringes of epinephrine, and sheer, unadulterated desperation. She drew up a heavy dose of the cardiac stimulant, her hands miraculously steady amidst the absolute chaos unfolding around her. "Don't you dare die on me after everything we just went through," she commanded fiercely, plunging the needle directly into his IV port. "Do you hear me, Declan? Keep fighting." She climbed onto the sofa, straddling his hips, and placed the heel of her hands over his sternum. She began chest compressions, the physical exertion tearing at her own bruised ribs from the orderly's earlier attack. 1, 2, 3, 4. She pushed with every ounce of strength she possessed. With every compression, memories of the past 3 months flashed through her mind. The quiet nights in room 412, the smell of rain against the window pane, the way his strong, tattooed fingers felt completely cold in her grasp. She had poured her soul into keeping him tethered to the earth, and she absolutely refused to let a traitor and a rival mob family sever that cord now. "Breathe, damn it!" she screamed, her voice cracking with raw emotion. A secondary explosion rattled the eastern wall. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, coating her hair and scrubs. Ronan cursed loudly in Gaelic, slamming a fresh magazine into his weapon. "Sadie! We have exactly 2 minutes before they blow the main hinges. We have to move!" Suddenly, Declan's chest arched violently beneath her hands. He dragged in a massive, ragged breath, his eyes snapping open. The gray irises were blown wide with shock and intense physical pain. He coughed violently, grabbing her wrists with surprising force to stop the compressions. "I'm here," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the relentless gunfire. "I'm here. Tunnel." Now Sadie choked out, hot tears of relief mingling with the plaster dust on her cheeks. She scrambled off him, helping him sit up. Ronan abandoned his post at the door, sprinting over to haul Declan to his feet. Together, they dragged the Mafia Boss toward the back of the safe house. Ronan kicked away an ornate oriental rug, revealing a heavy steel grate set into the concrete floor. He hauled it open with a grunt, exposing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the earth. "Down, both of you," Ronan ordered. "I'll rig the C4 on the door. It'll buy us a head start." Sadie practically carried Declan down the stairs, the damp, musty smell of the underground tunnels wrapping around them. They stumbled blindly in the darkness until Ronan caught up, a heavy tactical flashlight cutting through the gloom. Above them, a muffled, earth-shaking boom signaled the detonation of the safe house, burying Callum O'Shea and any Moretti soldier foolish enough to step inside under tons of burning concrete and steel. 3 weeks later, the storm that had nearly claimed Declan Walsh's life had finally broken, leaving behind a new, undisputed king of the Boston underworld. The luxury penthouse overlooking the Charles River was bathed in the soft, golden light of sunset. Sadie stood on the massive glass balcony, wearing a silk emerald green dress that draped flawlessly over her curves. The severe bruising on her face had faded to a faint shadow, but the internal shifts from that terrifying night remained a permanent part of her. She hadn't returned to Mercy West. She couldn't. Declan had arranged for her entire life to be meticulously erased and rewritten. Her tiny apartment had been packed up, her resignation quietly filed by high-priced lawyers, and her safety permanently secured within the impenetrable fortress of the Walsh Syndicate's inner sanctum. Footsteps sounded softly on the hardwood floor behind her. Sadie didn't turn around. She recognized the steady, confident gait immediately. Declan stepped onto the balcony, sliding his arms around her waist from behind. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He smelled of rich espresso, bergamot, and the faint metallic scent of absolute power. The fever was gone. The bandages were removed, and the man holding her was a terrifyingly beautiful, lethal force of nature, fully restored to his former glory. "The Moretti family requested a parley this morning," Declan murmured, his lips brushing against her pulse point, sending a delicious shiver down her spine. "They are surrendering the southern docks. The war is officially over." "And Callum?" Sadie asked softly, leaning back into his embrace, finding comfort in the solid wall of his chest. Callum's remains were formally identified in the warehouse wreckage. He paid the ultimate price for his treason. Declan's grip tightened slightly, his hands resting protectively over her stomach. "My empire is entirely secure, Nightingale, and there is no one left to threaten you." Sadie closed her eyes, absorbing the profound warmth radiating from him. The transition from dedicated hospital nurse to the untouchable companion of a mafia boss had been dizzying, terrifying, and profoundly intoxicating. She had seen the darkest, most violent parts of his world, and yet she had never felt safer than she did right now, wrapped securely in his arms. Declan gently turned her around, his strong fingers tilting her chin up so she was forced to look into his piercing gray eyes. The cold, calculated predator she had seen awaken in the hospital room was replaced by a man looking at the only woman who had ever truly seen his soul. "I told you I remembered the smell of vanilla and the sound of your voice," Declan said softly, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "But I never told you what kept me fighting when the darkness tried to pull me under for good."
"What was it?"
Sadie whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs just as it had in room 412. "I needed to see the face of the angel who refused to let me die," he replied, his voice a gravelly caress. "I owe you my life, Sadie, but more than that, I want to give you the world. If you want to leave, I have a private jet waiting at Logan, a brand new identity, millions in an untraceable offshore account. You will never have to look over your shoulder again." He paused, the raw vulnerability in his eyes a stark contrast to his fearsome, ruthless reputation. "But if you stay by my side, not as a nurse, not as a hostage, as my queen." Sadie looked at the sprawling city below them, the vast, shimmering empire that bowed to the man standing before her. She thought about her lonely life before room 412, the endless, exhausting shifts, the quiet desperation of her solitary existence. She looked back at Declan, the raw, primal connection pulling them together like inevitable magnets. She reached up, her fingers threading into his dark, thick hair. She didn't need to read Sun Tzu to understand this strategy. The war was already won. "I'm not going anywhere," Sadie whispered, right before pulling his lips down to hers. The kiss was a breathtaking collision of fire and salvation, sealing their fate completely. The sweet nurse hadn't just saved the dangerous mafia boss. She had claimed his dark heart entirely, ready to rule the shadows by his side forever. Did this gripping mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the thrilling twists, intense drama, and the undeniable chemistry between Sadie and Declan, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this amazing video with your friends who love dark romance, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking stories. Comment down below what you think happens next in their dangerous world.